Fritz Kreisler, along with Jascha Heifetz, those two were the two most important violinists of the 20th century. If you disagree with me on that point, please let me know why in the comments. That's absolutely fine. However, I'm highly unlikely to be budged from my view on that, in all honesty. What comes to your mind when you put on a piece of music by Fritz Kreisler and close your eyes? For me, it brings back a conversation that I had with my violin teacher decades ago. He said it's like sipping an expensive glass of slightly sweet red wine, sitting on some expensive furniture, perhaps in Alt Wien, Vienna before the Third Reich. But so many word pictures could come into your mind, such as the imaginative, evocative, and nostalgic character of the music of Kreisler. The Jewish son of Anna and Samuel, the family would soon convert to Catholicism, as did a number of prominent Jewish people at that time in Europe seeking acceptance in a society prone to anti-Semitism. Kreisler was an Austrian-born violinist who was a secret composer of short violin pieces. He left music for a short while, had a hiatus from music, but in around 1898 or 1899 returned to the stage with a vengeance as a concert violinist and went on to become one of the most successful virtuosos of his time. Fritz Kreisler forever changed the way that we listen to and play the violin, and was a disarmingly charming revolutionary, to quote the Strings magazine. Strings magazine says his music making was animated by a riveting vibrato, the likes of which no one had previously possessed or even imagined, and he used it constantly even in passage work. Something else no one had imagined. This is where we sometimes refer to the term impulsive vibrato or natural vibrato. The point is, though, that Fritz Kreisler's vibrato dramatically changed the style of violin playing. Soon other violinists were practically required to emulate the great Viennese, and did so with pleasure. Without Kreisler, violin playing simply would not sound the way it does today. To begin with then, let's go through the timeline of his life. 1882, he becomes the youngest entrant to Vienna Conservatory. 1885, wins the Vienna Conservatory Gold Medal at age 10. 1898, his professional European debut commences. 1910, he premieres the Elgar Violin Concerto under the composer, the concerto having been dedicated to him. 1921, he's welcomed back to London, makes HMV recordings in England and goes on to tour Japan and China. 1924, he moves to Berlin. 1935, some unwelcome headlines. A scandal erupts when he admits that the Baroque pieces he transcribed are actually his own work. 1941, Kreisler is the victim of a street accident, knocked down by a truck in a quite serious accident, but he recovers. 1947, he gives his last public concert at Carnegie Hall. 1950, he retires. There are celebrations for his 75th birthday, and he dies in New York on January the 29th, 1962. Let's go through his fascinating life in some more detail then. He was born in 1875 in Vienna. His full name was actually Friedrich Max Kreisler, but he was called Fritz for short. He actually shared the same birthday as Jascha Heifetz, February the 2nd. The two greatest violinists of the 20th century born on the same day. He died in America on January the 29th, 1962. Kreisler was born into a family with a strong musical background. His Polish-born father was himself a gifted amateur violinist. Fritz Kreisler demonstrated prodigious talent from an early age. Interestingly, his father Salomon Severin Kreisler was a physician. Perhaps this shaped a decision Kreisler would later make, which we'll come to later on in this video. More on that later. His father had come to Vienna from Krakow, Poland. Kreisler was baptized as a Catholic aged 12, so it seems like the family decided to convert. He'd started the violin aged 4 and his father was his first teacher. Already by the age of 4, Kreisler had drawn the attention of Vienna's major musicians. His father realised he had something else on his hands here, something very special. He was given a miniature violin then. Once his father realised that he had super talent, he brought him a better one. His first professional teacher was Jacques Aubert, a theatre concert master. Aubert later advised the young Kreisler to enroll at the Vienna Conservatory in 1882. At age 7, Kreisler entered the Vienna Conservatory, the first student under 10 to be accepted, where he studied under Anton Bruckner, Jakob Dont and Joseph Helmersberger Jr. At the age of 10, he won the Conservatory's gold medal. It is said that his musical comprehension at that time was already of a professional level. And he also studied piano at the Conservatory, for which he had an exceptional talent. Later he went to the Paris Conservatory, where as well as violin he studied composition, and he was there between 1885 and 1887, where his teachers included Léo Delibes, Lambert Massard and Jules Massenet. A group of friends had presented Kreisler with a 3/4 size Amati and encouraged him to go and study in Paris as well as his teacher. This would be the first of many famous Italian antique violins that would pass through Kreisler's hands. He graduated from the Paris Conservatory with a degree of Premier Prix gold medal at the age of 12, competing against 40 other players, all of whom were at least 20 years of age. He brushed them aside and won the gold. Alongside violin, as mentioned, Kreisler was studying composition, and he received numerous prizes and medals for his composition works. His mother, though in poor health, had accompanied Fritz to Paris and played an important role in his early life. So we're getting the sense of him being born with a special gift. The pianist Moritz Rosenthal heard him and engaged him as assistant artist for a concert tour, 50 concerts in total, including many concerts in America. And he was paid around $50 per concert, which is maybe the equivalent of around $1,700 today. Not bad for a young teenager. He made his United States debut at the Steinway Hall in New York City on November the 10th, 1888. So then began his first tour of the United States in 1888 and 1889 with Moritz Rosenthal, and so he toured America at age 13, playing the Mendelssohn Concerto with the Boston Symphony. The following year he performed the Faust Fantasy by Wieniawski with the Chicago Symphony, actually the orchestra that would become the Chicago Symphony, as that was in fact founded in 1891. On this early tour he did not receive the acclaim that Europe afforded him. America was not quite ready for him, it seems. Lewis C. Elson of the Daily Advertiser was one of the few in America at this time to recognise his talent, describing the young Kreisler as a genius destined to become a very great artist. Prophetic words indeed. According to Henry Roth, Kreisler spoke with a lisp and also had an intrinsic sense of humour throughout his life. After his tour of America, Kreisler returned to Austria and applied for a position in the Vienna Philharmonic, but was turned down by the concertmaster Arnold Rose. As a result, he made an interesting choice to leave music in order to study medicine, and spent 4 years in academic and pre-medical studies. Some say that he did not even touch the violin during this time. He spent a brief time in the army, where he would perform for the soldiers, And it's during this time that he composed his monumental Beethoven Concerto Cadenzas. He spent a total of 2 years in the army, and while in the army gave a performance of the Violin Concerto No. 1 by Max Bruch, conducted by none other than Hans Richter. This performance proved to be pivotal in his performing career and propelled him to international acclaim. He travelled to the UK, Germany, and returned to the USA, where he met his future wife, Harriet Leese. Apparently he also studied art in Paris and Rome, but then returned properly to the violin. Can you imagine how he must have felt when he picked up his violin again after his hiatus, feeling a little rusty? Surely this is one of the most incredible violin sabbaticals and amazing comebacks ever. Other violinists were known to take sabbaticals, notably Menuhin, but not in this manner, to completely change direction, change career, before returning to the violin. As a young man, Kreisler was leading a Bohemian existence, spending most of his time in gambling dens, pawn shops, and the arms of a succession of lovers. You could say it was kind of a rock and roll lifestyle in his youth, reminding us of Paganini and other 19th century virtuosos. Apparently he once ran off to Finland with a flame of his, and on another occasion pawned his violin to buy expensive presents for another girl he became infatuated with in Paris. And during this period he began composing his vignettes. Carl Flesch, who knew him and his playing well, described one performance during this period. Kreisler's Cantilena was an unrestrained orgy of sinfully seductive sounds, depravedly fascinating, whose sole driving force appeared to be a sensuality intensified to the point of frenzy. Indeed, sensual is often tied to Kreisler's sound. He played before the Sultan in Constantinople, and in 1899, when he gave a concert with the Berlin Philharmonic conducted by Arthur Nikisch, at this concert his older colleague Isai famously gave him a standing ovation. His star had begun to rise. But like other famous violinists before him, such as Paganini, Wieniawski and Isai, he was a hedonist, lacking direction and self-discipline. He badly needed to meet the right woman. During a concert tour of the United States in 1901, Kreisler met Harriet Leese, a New York-born divorcee who was a Vassar graduate and the daughter of a German-American tobacco merchant. They fell in love immediately and were married a year later, though they repeated the ceremony 3 more times because of legal technicalities. Because she was a divorcee, they first married in a civil ceremony, and not until 1947 were they able to marry in a Catholic ceremony. Harriet was a wealthy woman, a Catholic, and would bring Kreisler under control. Roth describes her as an iron-willed, imperious lady. Have you ever wondered what of Kreisler's children? Well, they had no children, and Harriet devoted her life to his career. They were married for 60 years until his death in 1962. She was his temperamental opposite. She became his manager and minder. He credited her with his success. As the saying goes, behind every good man is a good woman. This reminds me a little of Camperley and his wife, and even Ozzy Osbourne and Sharon, where the woman provides clear direction for her successful husband in order for him to continue to succeed. According to Strings magazine, the frenzied sensuality mellowed into something more akin to a warm, reassuring hug. Next to his wife, his closest friend was his manager, Charles Foley. In 1910, Kreisler gave the premiere of Sir Edward Elgar's Violin Concerto, a work commissioned by and dedicated to Kreisler. He served briefly as an officer in the Austrian army in World War I, rejoining his old regiment, before being honourably discharged after he was wounded. Kreisler's war was very short. He was at the outbreak of war devoted to the Kaiser and also an active reservist in the Austrian army, having spent 2 years in the army before. So sort of swept up by patriotism and duty, you could say. The Austrian army stupidly sent him straight into the trenches instead of using such a famous violinist for propaganda purposes and keeping him safe. And that's how he got injured, and we're lucky he survived, really. A little more detail on Kreisler's wounds during World War I. He'd been wounded by a Russian bayonet and lay injured in the trench for 7 hours before being picked up. There was some confusion as to his condition. Some publications even reported that he had been killed. The field hospital to which he was sent to recover was somewhat coincidentally the hospital that his wife was serving at as a nurse. His injuries were serious enough that he was judged by an army panel physically unfit for army duty at the front or at home, and he was exempted from further service. In 1915, he wrote a diary called 4 Weeks in the Trenches, the War Story of a Violinist. He arrived in New York on November the 24th, 1914, and so spent the remainder of the war years in America. America would not enter the war until 3 years later, of course. After the war, he helped support the families of some of his fallen comrades for many years, and this is typical Kreisler generosity. When the United States entered the war in 1917, Kreisler, who had fought in the army, now fighting US forces, stopped giving concerts and turned to composing. His reputation plummeted in America later on in the war, when America joined the war, and in the 1917-18 period, many of his so-called friends deserted him, and he was even forced to retire from the music scene for a while. He was not able to perform on the concert stage at this time. But after the war, he continued to do well. By 1920, 1921, the public had fully forgiven him. By the mid-1920s, Kreisler was earning $3,000 per concert, and in 1944 he received as much as $5,000 for each of his 5 broadcasts. He was given the preposterous amount of $1,000 for 50 of his compositions and so-called transcriptions in 1910 by B Shop Music, but this was later adjusted to be commensurate with his skyrocketing reputation, so he almost got ripped off there. By 1914, he was also one of the highest paid recording artists at the time. He began to record and to publish the many arrangements and compositions violinists still love to play to this day. He returned to Europe in 1924, living first in Berlin until 1938, then moving to France in 1938. When the Nazis came to power, his stupendous career in Germany was brought to an abrupt end. Kreisler stopped performing there in 1933. He established an award which he personally gave to the best violinist at his alma mater, the Wiener Musikakademie, Vienna Music Academy, each year from 1924 to 1938. We'll talk some more about that award later in the video. Shortly thereafter, at the outbreak of World War II, he settled once again in the United States, becoming a naturalized citizen in 1943. And he lived there for the rest of his life, giving his last public concert in 1947 and broadcasting performances for a few years after that. On April 26, 1941, Kreisler was involved in a serious traffic accident. Struck by a truck while crossing a street in New York, he suffered a fractured skull and was in a coma for over a week. This impaired his ability to perform for the rest of his life. He could not perform at all in public again until January 1942. He retired from public concerts in 1947, though continued playing on the radio until 1950. In his later years, he suffered not only from some hearing loss, but also sight deterioration due to cataracts. Kreisler died of a heart condition aggravated by old age in New York City in 1962. He was 86 years old, just shy of 87. He was interred in a private mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in New York City. Let's talk now about Kreisler's compositions. Kreisler wrote a number of pieces for the violin, including solos for encores, such as Liebeslied and Liebesfreude. Some of Kreisler's compositions were pastiches, ostensibly in the style of other composers. They were originally ascribed to earlier composers such as Gaetano Pugnani, Giuseppe Tartini and Antonio Vivaldi, and then in 1935 Kreisler revealed that it was he who actually wrote the pieces, When critics complained, Kreisler replied that they had already deemed the compositions worthy. "The name changes, the value remains," he said. His colleagues apparently already were in the know about this great ruse. He also wrote operettas, including Apple Blossoms in 1919 and Sissi in 1932, a string quartet and cadenzas, including ones for Brahms' Violin Concerto, Paganini's D Major Violin Concerto and Beethoven's Violin Concerto. His cadenzas for the Beethoven Concerto are the ones most often played by violinists today. This is what the Gramophone magazine had to say about this event. A blot on Kreisler's copybook, or an uproarious joke, was the storm that engulfed him in 1935. Needing to discuss the Pugnani Preludium and Allegro in a lecture recital with Yehudi Menuhin, New York Times critic Olin Downs asked Kreisler about the location of the original manuscript, and in a cable the violinist came clean. His classical manuscripts, 17 pieces plus a Vivaldi concerto, were virtually his own inventions. The controversy made headlines worldwide, although most colleagues had long guessed the truth. Elman was upset, some critics were censorious, Ernest Newman got particularly huffy, but the general mood was amused tolerance, and violinists still play much of the music. As a composer, Kreisler was most noted for writing original cadenzas for famous violin concerti. His Beethoven and Mozart cadenzas in particular are still performed today. His longest work is probably his operetta Apple Blossoms of 1919, music he created along with Victor Jacobi. He also showed himself to be something of a musical mimic. He fooled critics by writing pastiches of earlier composers' styles, and only later revealing they were by himself. Kreisler also wrote the music for the 1936 movie The King Steps Out, directed by Joseph von Sternberg, based on the early years of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. His classical manuscripts, published as his arrangements of works by Antonio Vivaldi, François Couperin, Johann Stamitz, Padre Martini and others, were admitted in 1935 to be works of his own. Many of these compositions were initially presented as the work of long-dead composers and revealed as originals only decades later, to the chagrin of gullible music critics. What of Kreisler's technique and practice routine? Kreisler's technique was characterized by an intensive vibrato and an economy in bowing. Kreisler's attitude to practicing, well, he was against it. He believed that everything is in the brain. You think of a passage and you know exactly how you want it. Too much practice, he said, benumbs the brain, renders the imagination less acute and deadens the alertness. He preferred warming up not before a recital but during its first 15 or 20 minutes, and he was talented enough to get away with it, although according to Zeno Francescati there were times that his neglect of technical work showed in his playing. So he didn't practice or warm up before a concert. Instead, he's said to have dipped his fingers in warm water for a few seconds. Menuhin was not as dedicated as Heifetz when it came to scales, but even Heifetz didn't over-practice, maybe 4 hours or so a day. Milstein was perhaps the other extreme, as he was known to carry the violin about his person all day long. It was also rumoured that Kreisler's sight reading wasn't great. This is apparently the reason why Arnold Rose had turned him down for the second desk vacancy in the Vienna Hofhofer Orchestra when Kreisler was young, although Roth hints that professional jealousy was probably at play here. Perhaps Rose simply thought that the young upstart would stick out like a sore thumb, according to Tully Potter in the August 2024 Gramophone magazine. Kreisler was notoriously indolent and reluctant to practice. Stories are legion of his arriving for a gig and saying, "I must check on my violin, I haven't touched it for a week." He was one of the blessed few who could pick up the fiddle and get a good sound straight away. The Czech violinist Josef Suk was another. Skillful at rubato and known for his constant bow changes, he also got through a lot of bows, but since he preferred more modern ones, not the precious French ones as a general rule, the more precious bows weren't the ones that got damaged by Kreisler. And so he used strong, more modern bows screwed to inordinate tension. Kreisler's tempo was generally on the slow side, and like many violinists of the time, most, if not all violinists of the time, he shunned the use of shoulder pads. And what stands out, of course, about Kreisler is his vibrato, of course. Kreisler brought vibrato home from his studies in Paris and developed it out of all recognition. In his hands, the vibrato was constant, starting at the outset of each note. He was the first to use continuous vibrato. Carl Flesch said that he had an extraordinarily intensive vibrato. Seductive slides and portamentos and position changes all combined to form Kreisler's unique style. In the words of Henry Roth, the sensual nuances of his art were balanced out by celestial spiritual qualities. When Kreisler reached Britain around the beginning of the 20th century, his vibrato was a revelation to Lionel Tertis, who immediately adapted it to the viola. Pablo Casals brought his own variation of the Kreisler sound to the UK in 1899. Another cellist whose vibrato was influenced by Kreisler was William Henry Squire. Of course, all the violinists after him were influenced by it. Kreisler was reportedly exceptionally kind to his pianist accompanists, which cannot be said of every violinist, of course. And those pianists included the likes of Arpad Sandor and André Benoist, among others. Apparently, Joachim was not enamoured by the young Kreisler's playing. It took many years for his then unorthodox sound and style, especially his sensuous vibrato, to win mass audience acceptance, particularly in Central Europe. Even in his hometown of Vienna, many had initially preferred Huberman to Kreisler. Two notable students of his to mention, Samuel Dushkin, who worked with Stravinsky on his violin concerto, and Louis Edlin, the concertmaster of the Cleveland Symphony in the early 1920s. Kreisler loved making music with friends. Once, when he and John McCormack were messing about at the tenor's home, McCormack delightedly told his wife, "I made a sound just like Fritz." He played string quartets and chamber music with his colleagues privately wherever possible. His own string quartet in A, rich in colour and lustrous harmony, was recorded in 1935 with William Primrose, Thomas Perry and Laurie Kennedy. He didn't record that many of the great concertos. Apart from his own concerto in the style of Vivaldi, Kreisler recorded only 5 concertos. Beethoven, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Mozart No. 4, actually recorded twice, and his own subscription of Paganini No. 1. He did record the Max Bruch No. 1, but this was not issued officially. His cadenzas for the Brahms and Beethoven and the Tartini's Devil's Trill Sonata rank among the finest ever composed. Experts have disagreed as to Kreisler's means of producing his unique portamenti, the precise combination of old and new finger sliding and bow accentuation. What certainly distinguished them was the vitality of vibrato on the arrival note, in contrast with the painfully old-fashioned approach of some contemporaries. Also very much Kreisler's own was his bowing style. Disdaining the long, sustained bow strokes most violinists slave to master, he played with a very tight bow, using accented strokes at the middle with frequent bow changes. Isaac Stern estimated that Kreisler used only 70% of his bow. After his 1941 accident, his playing wasn't quite the same, but aside from his last recordings, his discography generally shows him at his highest level. As well as the concertos we mentioned, Kreisler also recorded a noteworthy Grieg sonata with Sergei Rachmaninoff at the piano. And he recorded a huge number of short pieces, leading some detractors to label him as a salon player. Of course, that's not what he was. His compositions are of the highest quality of taste. He was able to handle the major classics, the standard classics of the repertoire. On the 17th of July 1944, aged 69, he performed the first movement of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto and two pieces with NBC SO musicians under the competent Donald Voorhees. The Mendelssohn and Albanese Tango are here, and Kreisler's own Caprice Viennois was issued as a V-disc. The main treasure is the complete Viotti A minor concerto from two 1945 concerts. Kreisler recorded a huge number of short pieces. A Bach air from 1904 features that sensuous vibrato that first shocked and then seduced audiences. Recordings of his own compositions everyone ought to hear include Liebeslied, Liebesfreude, Tambourin Chinois, Caprice Viennois, the stylish Polichinelle, the courtly faux couperin piece La Précieuse, the temperamental Gypsy Caprice, the intimate London Derrière, and the Marche Miniature Viennoise, with Fritz's brother Hugo joining in on cello. Two Dvorak Slavonic dances are replete with sorrow, nostalgia and verve, while humoresque scores high on both sentiment and intensity. Massenet's Méditation from Thais is played with a flowing lyricism that never lets up, while Cyril Scott's Lotus Land serves as a languorous pretext for gorgeous rubato and portamento. Iberian-inflected gems include two Albanese pieces, a juicy malagueña and a sultry tango, and a suave, sparkling fire Spanish dance. Poldini's Poupée Valsante is buoyant, Hymn to the Sun from Rimsky's Golden Cockerel, luxuriant in tone, while Chopin's A minor mazurka serves as an object lesson in masterful rubato. I'll leave the reference to this I'm quoting from in the description box. Kreisler made hundreds of records, including the Bach Double Concerto with Ephraim Zimbalist, slightly cut, three sonatas by Beethoven, Grieg and Schubert with Rachmaninoff, duets with McCormack, and his own string quartet with three London players. What of his violins? Kreisler owned several antique violins made by luthiers Antonio Stradivari, Pietro Guarneri, Giuseppe Guarneri, and Carlo Bergonzi, most of which eventually came to bear his name. He also owned a Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume violin of 1860, which he often used as his second violin, and which he loaned to the young prodigy Joseph Hasid. In 1952, he donated his Giuseppe Guarneri to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., where it remains in use for performances given in the library. Kreisler was fortunate to play on a wide range of 6 of Stradivari's instruments throughout his career. He could weave his spell on even quite humble instruments. Myriad violins by famous makers passed through his hands, but also some to which most rivals would not give a second look. When he came to London to record concertos, orchestral players crowded round, begging him to try their fiddles, and when he obliged, they had never before heard such sounds issue from their implements, quoting from Gramophone magazine. Kreisler's gifts extended to piano playing. He and Harold Bauer once performed Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata at a concert in Portland, Oregon, then swapped instruments to play it again at the party afterwards. And to being memorably creative, I began to compose and arrange as a young man. I wanted to create a repertoire for myself, he said. His compositions, notably influenced by the Viennese musical traditions of his youth, include popular pieces such as Liebeslied, Liebesfreude and Schön Rosmarin, which are now staples in the repertoire of violinists. When he passed away in 1962, he left behind a rich cultural imprint on the world of classical music. His legacy included one of the largest private collections of 18th century violins, and some still bear his name. Remember that we mentioned earlier in the video that Kreisler established an award which he gave personally to the best violinist at his alma mater, the Wiener Musikakademie, Vienna Music Academy, each year from 1924 to 1938. Well, in 1979 the award was made international and is given every 4 years to an outstanding young violinist. Kreisler's compositions may constitute his most lasting legacy. His works play major roles in violinists' repertoire, and they are used as teaching pieces on which young violinists perfect their technique. Many of the cadenzas, violin solos he wrote for Brahms and Beethoven violin concerti are still heard in performances of those pieces. His arrangements of Antonin Dvorak's Slavonic dances and Arcangelo Corelli's La Folia are still popular. So what is your favourite Kreisler composition if you had to select one? Let me know in the comments. Mine would have to be the Preludium and Allegro. Why Heifetz never recorded this beats me, but his student Eugene Fodor did a very good job of it. I can't help thinking though how wonderful this would have sounded had Heifetz recorded it. And indeed, Kreisler, because he didn't record the piece either, I don't think. If a version of it exists somewhere, do let me know. But apparently, even Kreisler did not record the Preludium and Allegro, which is a shame. Quoting Thomas Zehetmeyer in the Strad of February 2024, Kreisler's playing is wonderfully convincing, and he was an absolutely timeless musician. And let's quote a little bit from Henry Roth's book, Violin Virtuosos, on how the baton passed from the old school of Isai and the 19th century tradition on to Kreisler, who brought violin playing forward into the 20th century, was the pivot into the more modern style of playing that we hear today, continued of course by Heifetz when he burst on the scene. On page 34 of Roth's book, Roth says that in the inevitable struggle between old and new, the sensual players of tonal opulence were destined to triumph. He describes Fritz Kreisler as the direct heir to Isai. And he says it would be difficult to name a violinist more beloved by his public and colleagues alike, and describes him as one of the most individualistic performers in the annals of public art. Indeed, Kreisler's is an instantly recognisable sound. Some other interests of his: he was a collector of rare books and manuscripts, a linguist, a philosopher, an intellectual, and a humanist. Apparently, a one-time friend of Benito Mussolini, he was also a friend of Albert Einstein, so he had many different types of friends. His music making endeared him to almost everyone. His 80th and 85th birthdays were opportunities for his colleagues to pay homage. There is a story about Heifetz playing a Kreisler piece behind the curtain. Everyone thought he was Kreisler as he did such a good job impersonating him. And then the curtain opened and they realised it was Heifetz. When Kreisler was in his coma, Heifetz refused to play his pieces out of respect until he had recovered. And I did hear of this funny anecdote. Apparently, Kreisler's humour was legendary. On one occasion, a mother brought her child to Kreisler and then asked him to listen to her child's playing. And then at the end, she asked, "What do you think of my child's execution?" To which Kreisler responded, "I think that would be a good idea." Apparently, the child's playing was terrible. See my other video for the prank that the young Kreisler played on Bruckner using his own dog during his time at the Paris Conservatoire. The Gramophone magazine sums it up as follows: in Kreisler's hand, the violin had a unique voice. It did not just sing, it radiated a spectrum of hues, distilling a blend of warmth and sweetness that was rarely cloying because it was so musically deployed. His double stopping was legendary, and he coloured notes by placing his fingers in unusual positions. Kind, generous and cultured, for half a century Kreisler was the most adored violinist among his peers, critics and public. He survived the Great War, Jascha Heifetz's explosive arrival, Hitler's rise, a scandal over his compositions, the invasion of Austria, and emigration to New York. His wife, Harriet, a termagant with a positively harpic personality, kept his nose to the grindstone.